My name is Jim Yanks. I'm a product manager with Iridium's Position, Navigation, and Timing Group, otherwise known as PNT. Today, we're going to discuss how to set up Iridium Satellite Time and Location STL service on the Adtran 5405S and optimize it for indoor use. Here we have the STL receiver. This is an Adtran 5405S receiver. It has STL and GNSS capabilities. The receiver also has an OCXO oscillator and has PTP Grandmaster functions all built into this small box. STL can be used as a standalone signal or as a backup to GNSS depending on what your application needs. STL monitoring can also happen via available software connecting it on the USB-C port. These are the connections on the Adtran OSA 5405 receiver. There is a GNSS STL port for dual band Iridium GNSS or GNSS only antennas, and there's an STL only port for the Iridium antenna. The STL only port is unique in that it adds plus 3 dB to your signal. So that's why we use that for indoor use. We get that extra dB that helps drive those indoor applications. We have a USB-C port here that you can use for an optional software package to kind of view your bursts and where they're coming from. There's on the back side, we have channel 1, which is the PPS output by default. Channel 2 is the 10 megahertz default. And then this here is IRGB. It's mostly for power company application use and not part of this presentation. And then all the way on the end here, we have the power cord. On the 5405S, these lights are also your startup and LED status lights. And there's a variety of lights. And it takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to sync up outdoors. Indoors, it's going to take a little longer just because you have to get enough bursts to actually sync. So that sometimes that takes a little time. But the LED sequence that's outlined in the Adtran 5405 manual is accurate, and you can follow those and you can see at what process you are in the boot up. One of the first steps in activating and getting the 5405S running properly is to make sure you have a subscription. Subscriptions are ordered from Adva Optical at support@advaoptical.com if you need a subscription. You use the Net1 connection and you connect over any kind of a PuTTY or terminal emulation software to the default IP address of the 5405S, which is 192.168.0.2. You'll log into the box, and then through command line, you can type in the different commands. For example, info STL will tell you the subscription end date. So typically, if you check that first, you're going to know if you have a subscription because you haven't gone past the end date. So that's the first check. Next, if you need a subscription, you'll do the command info space STL-INV. This will give you the STL serial number that Adva Optical will need to generate your subscription. Each box has a unique subscription. It cannot be copied from one box to another. Now we're going to talk about some of the CLI commands for setting up the STL indoor operations on the 5405S. I normally use PuTTY. You can use any terminal emulation software you want. We're going to the IP address 192.168.0.2. That's the default 5405S out of the factory IP address. We're going to connect onto that. Hit enter a few times and make sure you have the command prompt like we show here. The first command we want to do is info STL, so we want to check our subscription end date. If we are outside of that end date, then we need to request a new subscription. So we'll check that here in a minute. So we'll start with info STL, and then we can see our end date as our subscription end date, start date, end date. The end date's the important one. So you can see how this one expires 1/31/2025. So it's very important that you look at that to see if you have a valid subscription. The next thing we're going to do is, let's say we don't have a valid subscription and we need to get a subscription. We're going to go info STL-INV. This is going to show us our STL serial number, that's the serial number you need to order the subscription for the STL service. So you can see on the info STL-INV command, we have the STL serial number right here. This one is OSA-002533. Very important that you don't use these other serial numbers. It's got to be the STLN serial number. Now, let's say you do need a subscription. You've got your serial number. You contacted support at advaoptical.com to get a subscription. Now you get that subscription back from support, and now you want to load that subscription in. So I'm going to do configure, clock, STL, because we're working on the STL side, subscription, dash key. And then after that, it'll be a space and your 16-digit subscription. It varies in length, but you put the whole subscription ID into this field. You're going to hit enter, and then you'll do a save and reconfig. So I don't have an active one, so I'm going to go back on that. Next thing I'm going to do is a save and reconfig. And then it tells you wait 5 seconds, it'll be saved. So now we're saved. So now we've gone over how to identify your end date on subscription to see if you need one, how to get your STL serial number using the info space STL-I and V command, how to contact Adva Optical to get a subscription, and then how to configure or load that subscription key onto your 5405S. Configuring the 5405S for indoor optimized use is relatively straightforward. We run the antenna to the preferred location and get the best signal that we can, and then we connect that port to the STL only port. Remember, this has that plus 3 dB on this port, so it's very important to use that for indoor applications. We're going to configure the antenna, we're going to configure the power, we're going to turn power on, we're going to set up the timing preferences for the oscillator, and then we're going to just do a save and reconfig. Whenever you're programming on this box, either do a save or do a save and reconfig if it's a major hardware change. The next step after verifying we have a good subscription is to configure the antenna. The first thing we're going to do is to configure clock STL antenna-type space STL only. What that command is telling us is that we're setting up the antenna for the STL only port, which is critical for indoor applications. So I'm going to do configure, and you can do contextual typing if you want. So I can type configure, then I can look what my options are. Okay, there's clock. I want to do clock. I can hit enter. I want to do the next thing, which is STL, because we're using our STL port. And then we're going to do antenna type, antenna-type. And then we're going to tell what it's going to be. So we're going to do STL only. That's the antenna we're going to use. Okay, now it's done. It says do a save and reconfig or a save or an admin reboot for that option. So I'll do save and reconfig. Now we're going to set the antenna voltage. So we told it we're going to use the STL only port. So that's active now. Now we have to tell it what kind of voltage you need it. The antennas we typically use are active antennas, so you need to apply voltage. You can either have 3.3 volts or 5 volts. For indoor use, we always use 5 volts. So let's do that. Configure, clock, STL, and then antenna dash voltage. Then we're going to do space and a 5 with a capital V for 5 volts. And then this tells you exactly what to do. So when you look at it, if it tells you to do a save, do a save. If it says save and reconfig, always do a save and reconfig. There's nothing wrong with doing a save and reconfig all the time. Okay, next thing we want to do is turn the power on to that STL antenna port. So we've activated the port, so now I can read from the antenna. We've applied voltage or told it to use 5 volts, and now we're going to actually turn the power on to that device. So that command is going to be configure, clock, STL, antenna-power. So we're going to go configure, clock, STL, space antenna power. Okay, now we've applied power to the antenna. We've applied all the stuff we need for that antenna port, so we should be good to go on that. Now we're going to configure the references for the oscillator. We're going to use a command called configure clock references STL OCXO. So what we're doing is with that command, we're telling it to use the STL signal first, followed by the OCXO. And you could, in different applications, have other inputs that you're clocking off from. But for indoor use, STL is going to be the primary. You may have other stuff after that, but at the end of however many inputs you have, the OCXO has to be the last clock source. So for us, we're going to have STL and OCXO in our example today. So we're going to do that by doing a configure clock references STL OCXO. So config clock references STL space OCXO. That tells us to use the STL input as the primary source and the OCXO as the backup. We'll hit enter on that. And now we have that set up. To verify that you have your oscillator set up right, you can do a pretty simple command. You can do info references, hit enter, and now you can see where we have the STL has got a number 1 by it because that's our primary, and it also says selected, so that means that's the active port it's using. When you look on the bottom, you have a number 2 for the local OCXO, which is the onboard oscillator. That's got an OK. That means it's in hot standby. If anything happens, it's going to bounce over. This is what it should look like for indoor use. The next step is to verify that we are receiving and processing bursts. To do that, we're going to use the info space STL command. And what we're looking for is prior minute detected burst count and prior minute process burst count. These are the averages over the prior minute. So we want to look at averages. Since the STL signal is so bursty, we need to look at averages to get a good idea what kind of bursts we're receiving and then how many of those bursts we're able to process. Now that we've defined that we're receiving bursts and we're processing bursts, it's just a matter of waiting for the system to sync up. When you have completed all those commands, do a save -and -reconfig, and that will save everything to the running config on the 5405S.